The scent of late summer roses and freshly baked bread hung heavy and sweet in the air, a fragrant promise of the joy to come. Lilybeth Carver, her heart aflutter like the ribbons on her bridesmaids' bonnets, smoothed down the ivory silk of her wedding gown, a creation her mother had lovingly stitched, each thread a prayer for happiness. Outside the small clapboard church, the town of Redemption Creek buzzed with a rare, festive energy. Today, she was to marry Samuel Petty, the town's diligent young storekeeper, a kind, if somewhat predictable, man her parents thoroughly approved of. Lilybeth herself felt a quiet contentment, a sense of stepping dutifully into the life expected of her. The organ music swelled, a familiar, comforting melody signaling her cue. Her father, his face beaming with pride, offered his arm. But as she took her first step towards the aisle, towards Samuel, towards her future, the joyous murmur of the assembled guests was rent by a sudden, terrifying clamor, the thunder of hooves, harsh shouts, the splintering of wood. The church doors burst inward, not with a late-arriving well-wisher, but with a man whose presence was a cold shadow falling across the sunlit day, Jedediah Thorne. His name was a bitter taste on the tongues of Redemption Creek's townsfolk, a ruthless rancher from the north, known for his avarice, his callous disregard for others, and the string of broken lives he'd left in his wake. Lilybeth had only seen him from a distance, a dark, brooding figure, but now, as he strode down the aisle, his spurs clanking ominously on the wooden floorboards, his cruel eyes fixed on her, terror, cold and sharp, seized her. His men, a rough-looking trio, fanned out, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips, silencing the initial gasps of outrage from the wedding guests. Samuel, pale and trembling, stepped forward. "Thorne, what is the meaning of this?" "You have no right." Thorne backhanded him contemptuously, sending Samuel sprawling into a pew, dazed and whimpering. "I have every right, storekeeper." Thorne sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The Carver land borders mine. Old man Carver wouldn't sell. But a marriage settlement, that changes things. Lilybeth will be my bride." He grabbed Lilybeth's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. She cried out, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear, her carefully constructed composure shattering. Her father lunged forward, only to be brutally shoved back by one of Thorne's thugs. Panic erupted. Women screamed. Men shouted in impotent fury, but Thorne's men were a menacing wall. "Take her!" Thorne commanded, dragging a struggling Lilybeth towards the desecrated doorway. The beautiful wedding dress, her mother's dream, was now a symbol of her nightmare, its delicate lace catching on Thorne's rough clothing. Outside, a powerful black stallion snorted impatiently. Thorne threw her, none too gently, across the saddle, then swung up behind her, his arm a steel band around her waist, crushing the air from her lungs. The last thing Lilybeth saw as they galloped away from Redemption Creek was the horrified, helpless faces of her family and friends. Samuel still huddled in the pew, and the sun glinting off the church steeple, a beacon of a life now violently stolen. The town was left in stunned, outraged silence, the scent of roses now mingled with the acrid smell of fear and dust. Among the guests, however, stood one man who had not cried out, whose face, though grim, showed not helpless shock, but a cold, gathering fury. Caleb Ryder. A man of few words, a drifter who had been in Redemption Creek for only a few months, working odd jobs, his past a mystery. He was known for his quiet intensity, his skill with horses, and an air of solitary competence that set him apart. He had watched Thorne's brutal entrance, his eyes, the color of a winter storm, missing nothing. He'd seen Samuel's cowardice, the terror in Lilybeth's eyes, the arrogance of Thorne. As Thorne's horse disappeared in a cloud of dust, Caleb turned, his movements economical and purposeful. He didn't speak, didn't consult. He simply strode towards the livery, his jaw set, a silent vow hardening in his gaze. Actions, not words, were his creed. And Jedediah Thorne had just committed an act that demanded a reckoning. Lilybeth, jolting painfully with every stride of Thorne's horse, felt despair begin to claw at her. The wind whipped her veil across her face, stinging her eyes, mingling with the hot tears of terror and humiliation. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. Thorne's triumphant, possessive grip was a constant, vile reminder of her stolen future, her violated present. The man beside her was not a suitor, but a captor, his intentions as dark and ugly as the path he forced her down. The dream of a quiet life with Samuel, of children's laughter in a sunny yard, dissolved into the harsh reality of dust, fear, and the suffocating presence of Jedediah Thorne. She was a prize, a means to an end, her own hopes and desires utterly irrelevant. The vast, unforgiving landscape stretched before them, a canvas for her unfolding tragedy, each hoofbeat carrying her further from everything she knew, everything she held dear, towards a future too bleak to contemplate. The initial shock began to give way to a cold dread, a desperate, silent prayer for a miracle, for a hero, for anyone to deliver her from this living hell. But the empty plains offered no immediate solace, only the echo of Thorne's cruel laughter and the relentless pounding of the stallion's hooves. The sun climbed higher, a merciless eye in the vast, indifferent sky, beating down on Lilybeth as Thorne and his men pushed their horses hard, leaving Redemption Creek further and further behind. The initial frantic terror had subsided into a dull ache of despair, punctuated by sharp pangs of fear whenever Thorne's gaze lingered on her. Her beautiful wedding dress was now torn in several places, stained with dust and sweat, a mocking reminder of the joy that had been so brutally snatched away. She tried to keep her wits about her, to observe their surroundings, the direction they were heading, anything that might offer a sliver of hope. But the landscape was a monotonous blur of dry plains and distant, hazy mesas. Thorne, riding beside her on his black stallion, seemed to relish her distress. He spoke little, but his occasional sneering comments about her good fortune in becoming his wife and his plans for uniting their lands sent shivers of revulsion through her. His men, riding a short distance ahead and behind, were coarse and brutal, their leering glances making her skin crawl. Lilybeth thought of Samuel. A wave of shame washed over her for the small, disloyal thought that he had not been the hero she might have dreamed of in childhood fantasies. But then, who could stand against Thorne and his armed thugs? Samuel was a storekeeper, a man of ledgers and gentle habits, not a fighter. Yet, the image of his pale, frightened face as he cowered in the pew was a stark contrast to the furious, resolute expression she had fleetingly glimpsed on Caleb Ryder's face just before the church doors had slammed shut on her old life. Caleb, a man who had always seemed to observe everything from the fringes, his silence often mistaken for disinterest. But there had been something in his eyes that day, a glint of cold steel, a silent promise of action that now, in her desperation, she clung to as a drowning sailor clings to driftwood. Could he? Would he even try? He was a drifter, with no real ties to her or the town. Why would he risk himself? Back in Redemption Creek, chaos had given way to a grim council of war in the marshal's office. Marshal Brody, a man more accustomed to settling disputes over stray cattle than facing down armed kidnappers, was flustered and out of his depth. Samuel Petty, now recovered from his initial shock, blustered about forming a posse, but his voice lacked conviction, his eyes still wide with fear. It was Caleb Ryder who cut through the indecision. He had already saddled his own lean, rangy buckskin, checking his rifle and strapping on his gun belt with a quiet, focused intensity that commanded attention. "Thorne's heading north, towards his own territory," Caleb stated, his voice low and steady, devoid of emotion but carrying an undeniable authority. "He'll ride them hard first, then slow to conserve their horses once he thinks he's clear. We need to move fast if we're to cut him off before he reaches the Broken Spire Pass. Once he's through there, on his own land, it'll be 10 times harder." Marshal Brody looked at Caleb, a mixture of relief and apprehension on his face. "You think you can track them, Ryder?" "Thorne's got a good lead." Caleb's only reply was a curt nod. He didn't waste words. He knew Thorne's ways, knew the land. He had spent years traversing these territories, his past a shadowed landscape he rarely revisited in conversation, but one that had equipped him with skills few men possessed. Samuel, emboldened by Caleb's decisiveness, puffed out his chest. "I'll ride with you, Ryder. She's my intended." Caleb glanced at Samuel, his expression unreadable. "This ain't a Sunday ride, Petty. Thorne won't hesitate to shoot. You'll be a liability." The bluntness stung Samuel, but even he couldn't deny the truth in Caleb's assessment. A few other townsmen, braver or perhaps more reckless, volunteered, and a small, hastily assembled posse was formed. But it was Caleb they all looked to, his quiet competence, a beacon in their fear and outrage. As they rode out, Caleb pushed them at a relentless pace, his eyes constantly scanning the ground, reading the subtle signs. A disturbed pebble, a freshly broken twig, the faint imprint of hooves that told him the story of Thorne's flight. He was a man transformed, no longer the quiet drifter, but a hunter, focused and implacable. Lilybeth, meanwhile, fought to maintain her composure. She knew Thorne expected her to dissolve into hysterics, to be a pliant, terrified captive. But a spark of defiance, inherited from her spirited mother, began to glow within her. She wouldn't make it easy for him. When they stopped briefly to water the horses at a muddy creek, she deliberately stumbled, her foot accidentally dislodging a small, distinctive mother-of-pearl button from her glove, letting it fall into the soft mud by the water's edge. A tiny clue, perhaps, but it was something. Thorne, impatient, merely cursed and hauled her back onto the horse. He was confident, too confident, believing himself untouchable. As the day wore on, the strain began to tell on Lilybeth. The heat, the jolting ride, the constant fear, and the lack of food and water were taking their toll. She felt herself growing weaker, her hope beginning to fray. Yet, every time she closed her eyes, she saw not Samuel's frightened face, but Caleb Ryder's, grim and determined. It was an irrational hope, perhaps, but it was all she had. The vastness of the prairie, which had once seemed a symbol of freedom to her, now felt like an open prison, her captors the wardens, her future, a sentence of unbearable servitude to a man she despised. But deep within, a tiny ember of resilience still glowed, fanned by the faint, desperate hope that someone, somehow, was coming for her, that this nightmare could not be her end. The second day of Lilybeth's captivity dawned with a fiery sunrise that painted the stark landscape in hues of blood and despair. Thorne had pushed them relentlessly, only stopping for a few fitful hours of sleep under a cold, star-strewn sky. Lilybeth tied loosely to a saddle, her body aching, her spirit bruised. Her torn wedding dress was a constant, grim reminder of her stolen life. Thorne seemed to believe he had outrun any potential pursuit, his arrogance growing with every mile they covered. He began to speak more freely of his plans, of how Lilybeth would soon be mistress of his vast, lonely ranch, how their union would consolidate his power in the territory. His words were like acid, burning away at her dwindling reserves of hope. She tried to remain alert, looking for any opportunity, any weakness, but Thorne and his men were always watchful. The small, desperate act of dropping the button felt like a lifetime ago, a futile gesture in the face of their grim efficiency. Yet, Lilybeth clung to the memory of Caleb Ryder's face. It was a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. She found herself replaying their few brief encounters in Redemption Creek, his quiet observation in the general store, the rare, almost imperceptible nod of greeting as he passed her on the street, the way he handled horses with a gentle, knowing touch that belied his sometimes gruff exterior. These were small things, yet they painted a picture of a man different from the braggarts and bullies she often encountered. Meanwhile, Caleb Ryder pushed the posse with a grim, almost inhuman endurance. He allowed them little rest, his focus absolute. Some of the townsmen grumbled, unused to such a relentless pace, their initial bravado fading under the strain. Marshal Brody, though weary, deferred to Caleb's judgment, recognizing the drifter's superior skill and unwavering determination. Caleb read the trail like an open book. He found the discarded mother-of-pearl button by the muddy creek, his expression betraying nothing as he tucked it carefully into his pocket. It was a sign. She was fighting, leaving what clues she could. This small act of defiance from Lilybeth fueled his own resolve. He knew this land, knew its secrets, its hidden waterholes, its treacherous paths. He also knew Jedediah Thorne, knew his ambition, his cruelty, and his likely route. Thorne would be heading for the Broken Spire Pass, a narrow defile that was the quickest way onto his own sprawling ranch lands. If they could reach the pass first, or intercept him before he entered it, they might have a chance. The pursuit was a grueling test of will and endurance. The sun beat down, dust choked their lungs, and the horses began to tire. One of the townsmen's horses went lame, forcing him to turn back, his face a mask of frustration and shame. Samuel Petty, surprisingly, was still with them, driven by a mixture of guilt, fear for Lilybeth, and a desperate desire to prove himself. He struggled to keep up, his soft hands raw from the reins, his body unaccustomed to such hardship, but Caleb's occasional curt words of encouragement, or perhaps sheer stoic example, kept him going. Caleb rarely spoke, conserving his energy, his mind constantly calculating, assessing. He remembered Lilybeth on her wedding day, a vision in ivory and lace, her eyes shining with a gentle happiness. The image was a stark contrast to the one he now held of her, captive, terrified, yet resilient enough to leave a clue. A flicker of something protective, something more personal than mere duty, tightened his jaw. He had seen too much injustice in his life, too many innocents suffer at the hands of men like Thorne. This time he had been there. This time he could act. He'll likely camp tonight at a place called Whisper Creek, just before the pass. It offers good water and cover. We'll rest the horses for a few hours, then ride through the night. We need to be in position by dawn. The men, exhausted, nodded their agreement. Even Samuel, pale and swaying with fatigue, managed a determined nod. Lilybeth, miles ahead, felt a shift in the atmosphere among her captors. Thorne seemed more relaxed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. They were nearing his territory, his sanctuary. He ordered a halt by a small tree-lined creek, Whisper Creek, though Lilybeth didn't know its name. As one of Thorne's men, a brutish fellow named Harker, untied her to allow her a drink, his eyes lingered on her torn dress, a predatory gleam in them that made her blood run cold. Thorne noticed and barked at Harker to leave her be, not out of any concern for Lilybeth, but out of a possessive assertion of ownership. "She's mine, Harker. Remember that." The exchange filled Lilybeth with a fresh wave of revulsion and fear. She was nothing more than property to these men. As darkness fell, casting long, eerie shadows, she huddled by the small campfire, feigning sleep, her mind racing. The pass. Thorne had mentioned a pass they would reach by morning. If there was any hope of rescue, it had to come before then. She clutched the small, rough fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. The image of Caleb Ryder, his face grim, his eyes like chips of ice, burned in her mind. Was he out there? Was he close? Or was she truly alone, her fate sealed by the cruel ambition of Jedediah Thorne? The night was filled with the chirping of crickets and the mournful sigh of the wind, sounds that usually brought her comfort, but now seemed to echo her own despair. Yet, amidst the fear, a tiny, stubborn ember of defiance still flickered. She would not give up, not yet. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Caleb Ryder and his small, weary posse moved like ghosts through the shadowy foothills, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft pine needles underfoot. They had ridden through the darkest hours of the night, Caleb navigating by starlight and an uncanny instinct for the terrain. He had positioned them on a ridge overlooking the narrow entrance to Broken Spire Pass, the very route Thorne would have to take. Below them, in the dim gray light, they could just make out the flicker of Thorne's dying campfire at Whisper Creek. "They'll be moving soon," Caleb whispered, his voice a low rumble. He checked his rifle one last time, his movements economical and precise. Marshal Brody and the remaining townsmen, including a surprisingly resolute Samuel, took up their positions, their faces grim, the fatigue momentarily forgotten in the face of the imminent confrontation. Samuel clutched his shotgun, his knuckles white, his fear palpable but held in check by a desperate resolve. Lilybeth, startled awake by the sudden activity in Thorne's camp, felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Thorne was barking orders, his men hastily saddling the horses. The pass. They were heading for the pass. This was it, her last chance if any existed. As Thorne roughly pulled her towards his stallion, she stumbled, her eyes darting around, searching, hoping, praying. And then she saw it, a flicker of movement on the ridge above them, almost imperceptible in the shifting shadows. A figure, silhouetted against the first pale light of dawn. Caleb. A choked sob of relief and terror caught in her throat. He was here. Thorne, oblivious, mounted his horse, pulling Lilybeth up behind him. "Almost home, my dear." He sneered, his breath hot and unpleasant on her cheek. "Soon you'll see the grandeur of the Thorne estate. As Thorne's party began to move towards the narrow mouth of the pass, Caleb raised his hand, a silent signal. When Thorne was directly below them, exposed and vulnerable, Caleb's voice cut through the morning stillness, sharp and clear as a rifle crack. "Thorne, that's far enough. Let the woman go." Jedediah Thorne reined in sharply, his face contorting in a mask of fury and surprise as he looked up to see Caleb and the others arrayed on the ridge, rifles aimed. "Ryder!" He spat, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "Always sticking your nose where it ain't wanted. This is none of your concern." "You made it my concern when you stole a bride from her wedding." Caleb replied, his voice cold, unwavering. "Let her go, Thorne. There's nowhere for you to run." Thorne's eyes darted around, assessing the situation. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, but his arrogance, his belief in his own invincibility, wouldn't let him back down. "Never!" He snarled, and with a sudden, violent movement, he drew his pistol, using Lilybeth as a shield. "Try anything, Ryder, and the girl dies first." Lilybeth screamed, terror gripping her as Thorne's arm tightened around her throat, the cold metal of his gun pressing against her temple. In that instant, Caleb fired. Not at Thorne, but at the rock face just above him. The bullet ricocheted, sending a shower of stone chips raining down. Thorne flinched, his grip momentarily loosening. It was the opening Lilybeth needed. With a surge of desperate strength, she twisted, sinking her teeth into Thorne's arm, hard. He roared in pain and surprise, his hold faltering. Lilybeth shoved herself away from him, tumbling from the horse, landing heavily on the rocky ground, the breath knocked from her lungs, but blessedly free of his vile grasp. "Now!" Caleb yelled, and the ridge erupted in gunfire. Thorne's men, caught by surprise, scattered, returning fire wildly. Marshal Brody and his men laid down covering fire, while Caleb, with deadly accuracy, picked his targets. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet, but to disable, to disarm. One of Thorne's men cried out, clutching a wounded shoulder. Another's rifle flew from his grasp as a bullet struck the stock. Harker, the brutish one, charged recklessly towards Lilybeth, who scrambled backwards, her eyes wide with fear. But Samuel Petty, seeing Lilybeth in direct peril, found a courage he didn't know he possessed. He stood his ground, raised his shotgun, and fired. The blast caught Harker in the leg, sending him sprawling with a howl of agony. Thorne, seeing his men falling, his plans crumbling, turned his fury on Caleb. He fired wildly, his bullets kicking up dust around Caleb's position. Caleb remained calm, taking careful aim. He squeezed the trigger. Thorne cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground as he clutched a wounded hand, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Thorne's remaining men, seeing their leader down and their numbers depleted, threw down their weapons, their bravado gone. Caleb slid down the scree slope, his rifle still at the ready, his eyes never leaving Thorne. Marshal Brody and the others followed, quickly securing the prisoners. Caleb went straight to Lilybeth, who was pushing herself up, shaken but unharmed, her wedding dress now truly a tattered ruin. "Are you all right, Lilybeth?" he asked, his voice, though still gruff, holding a note of genuine concern. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of shock, relief, and an overwhelming gratitude that left her speechless. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face, tracing paths through the dust and grime. He offered her a hand, his grip strong and steady, pulling her to her feet. For a moment, they just stood there, the chaos of the aftermath swirling around them, the rising sun casting long shadows, the scent of gunpowder sharp in the air. She was free. Caleb Ryder, the quiet drifter, the fearless cowboy, had brought her back. The nightmare was over, but as she looked at Caleb, at the man who had risked everything for her, she knew, with a sudden, startling clarity, that her life, the one she had been heading towards in that little church in Redemption Creek, was over too. Something profound had shifted within her, something irrevocable, in the heart of the terror and the deliverance. The journey back to Redemption Creek was a stark contrast to the terrifying flight with Thorne. Though the pace was still swift, dictated by the need to get Lilybeth to safety and the prisoners to justice, there was an undercurrent of quiet triumph and immense relief. Lilybeth rode Caleb's sturdy buckskin, while Caleb himself walked beside her, his hand often resting lightly on the horse's flank, a silent, reassuring presence. The tattered remnants of her wedding dress had been augmented by a rough but clean blanket one of the townsmen had offered, shielding her from the chill of the morning and the curious, though now sympathetic, gazes of her rescuers. Samuel Petty rode nearby, his initial burst of courage having given way to a subdued, almost sheepish demeanor. He had acquitted himself bravely in the end, and Lilybeth felt a surge of gratitude for his actions, yet the chasm that had opened between them felt wider than the miles they traversed. He made several attempts at conversation, inquiries about her well-being, apologies for his earlier helplessness, but Lilybeth found her responses strained, her thoughts preoccupied. Her gaze kept drifting to Caleb Ryder. He spoke little, as was his way, his attention focused on the trail and the welfare of the group. Yet, in his occasional glances towards her, she saw a depth of concern, a quiet strength that resonated with her far more profoundly than Samuel's earnest pronouncements. She remembered the cold precision of his actions during the rescue, the unwavering calm in his eyes as he faced down Thorne. He was a man who dealt in realities, not platitudes. A man whose courage was not a sudden, desperate surge, but a deep ingrained part of his being. As they rode, the silence between Lilybeth and Caleb was not awkward, but filled with unspoken understanding. She learned more about him in those silent hours than she had in all the months he'd been in Redemption Creek. She saw the way he cared for his horse, the subtle signs of weariness around his eyes that he tried to conceal, the patient way he answered Marshal Brody's questions about the pursuit. These were the actions of a man of substance, a man of quiet integrity. One evening, as they made camp, Caleb approached her as she sat by the small fire, staring into the flames. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, its warmth seeping into her chilled hands. "You're safe now, Lilybeth," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Thorne won't trouble you again." "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the immensity of her gratitude. "You saved my life." "You saved more than my life," he shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise, his gaze shifting to the fire. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said quietly, firmly. "Not everyone." A companionable silence fell between them. Lilybeth found herself wanting to know more about this enigmatic man. "Why did you do it, Caleb? Risk so much for me?" "For Redemption Creek? You barely know us." He was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeing scenes from his own past. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with a hint of old sorrow. "I've seen what men like Thorne can do, seen good people hurt. Sometimes you just gotta make a stand." He didn't elaborate, and Lilybeth didn't press him. But in those few words, she glimpsed a history of hardship, perhaps loss, that had forged him into the man he was. It made his actions, his quiet heroism, all the more profound. As they neared Redemption Creek, a sense of trepidation began to mix with Lilybeth's relief. What awaited her there? Her family, undoubtedly overjoyed. But Samuel, the wedding that never was? The life she had been about to step into now felt like a borrowed dress, ill-fitting and foreign. The ordeal had changed her, stripped away the superficialities, revealing a core of strength she hadn't known she possessed, an awakening desire she hadn't dared to acknowledge. The quiet contentment she had once felt for Samuel now seemed a pale imitation of the powerful, unsettling emotions Caleb Ryder stirred within her. Respect, admiration, gratitude, and something more. Something akin to the trembling excitement of standing on the precipice of the unknown. She looked at Caleb, walking steadfastly beside her, his profile rugged and strong against the setting sun. He was not the man her parents would have chosen for her, not the man society would deem appropriate. He was a drifter, a man with a shadowed past and an uncertain future. Yet, he was the man who had faced death for her, the man whose quiet strength had been her beacon in the darkness. He had not just rescued her from Thorne, he had, in a strange way, rescued her from a life that was not truly her own. The path ahead was uncertain, her future a blank canvas, but for the first time since the nightmare began, Lilybeth felt not fear, but a tentative, burgeoning hope, and a startling, exhilarating sense of freedom. The stolen bride was returning, but she was not the same woman who had been taken. The sight of Redemption Creek rising from the prairie horizon brought a fresh wave of emotion over Lilybeth. Joy at her deliverance, apprehension about the reunion, and a profound sense of transformation. As the posse rode down Main Street, townsfolk poured out of their homes and businesses, their initial stunned silence erupting into cheers and cries of relief. Her parents rushed forward, tears streaming down their faces, enveloping her in a desperate, loving embrace. For a long moment, Lilybeth clung to them, the nightmare of the past few days receding in the warmth of their presence. Then, Samuel stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief and a hopeful, almost pleading eagerness. "Lilybeth," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you're safe." "Oh, thank God, you're safe." He reached for her hand, but Lilybeth, though she offered him a gentle smile of gratitude, found herself subtly withdrawing. Her gaze sought out Caleb, who stood slightly apart, his buckskin patiently waiting, his expression unreadable as he watched the reunion, a silent observer once more. Marshal Brody was already leading a securely bound Jedediah Thorne and his remaining men towards the town jail, the crowd parting to let them pass, their cheers turning to jeers and angry shouts directed at the captured villains. The immediate crisis was over, but Lilybeth's personal reckoning was just beginning. Later that day, after she had been bathed, fed, and fussed over by her mother, Samuel sought her out in the quiet of her parents' parlor. He spoke of rescheduling the wedding, of putting the terrible ordeal behind them, of resuming the life they had planned. He was kind, earnest, and clearly still considered her his intended. But as Lilybeth listened, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she could not go back. The woman who had stood at the altar, content with a predictable future, was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had tasted terror and found courage, someone whose heart now beat to a different rhythm. "Samuel," she began gently, her heart aching for the pain she knew she was about to inflict. "What I endured, it changed me. I am not the same person I was." She explained, as best she could, that while she would always be grateful for his concern, she could not marry him. The life they had envisioned together no longer felt true to her. Samuel was devastated, his face falling, but to his credit, he listened, a dawning understanding, however painful, in his eyes. Perhaps he too had sensed the irrevocable shift. The town, of course, buzzed with fresh speculation. The stolen bride was back, but the wedding was off. And whispers began to circulate about Caleb Ryder, the quiet hero who had all but disappeared after ensuring Lilybeth was safely home. Lilybeth found him by the livery, preparing to leave Redemption Creek. His few belongings were already packed on his buckskin. Her heart sank. "Caleb," she said, approaching him, her voice a little breathless, "you're leaving?" He turned, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of some unreadable emotion in his eyes. "My work here is done, Lilybeth. Thorne's where he belongs. But where will you go?" she asked, the thought of him riding out of her life again, this time, perhaps forever, causing an unexpected pang. He shrugged, a gesture that spoke of a lifetime of solitary wandering. "Wherever the trail leads." "Caleb," she said, taking a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "You saved me. You showed me what true courage is. I don't want you to go." The words hung in the air between them, a brave, vulnerable admission. Caleb stared at her, his usual stoicism momentarily shaken. He saw not the society belle nor the terrified captive, but the resilient, courageous woman who had bitten her captor and left clues for her pursuers, the woman who now stood before him, offering him something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for in many long years, a reason to stay. "Lilybeth," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "I'm just a drifter. I have nothing to offer a woman like you." "You have everything that matters, Caleb," she replied softly, stepping closer. "You have honor, courage, and a kind heart, even if you try to hide it. And you offered me my life, my freedom. Perhaps we could find a new trail together." A slow smile, rare and transformative, spread across Caleb's weathered face. He reached out, his calloused hand gently taking hers. "Maybe," he said, his voice full of a newfound warmth. "Maybe this drifter has finally found a reason to put down roots. Their love story wouldn't be conventional. Their path perhaps not always smooth, but it would be theirs, forged in fire, tempered by courage, and built on a foundation of mutual respect and a love that had unexpectedly blossomed in the face of terror." The stolen bride had not only been brought back, she had found her true hero, and in doing so, had found herself. And as you, dear viewer, reflect on Lilybeth's harrowing ordeal and her ultimate unconventional happiness, perhaps you recognize the unexpected turns life can take. How often do our carefully laid plans shatter, only to reveal a path we never imagined, a path leading to a truer version of ourselves, a deeper, more meaningful connection? Think about the heroes in your own life. Are they always the ones in shining armor, the ones society dictates? Or are they sometimes the quiet ones, the steadfast souls whose courage lies not in grand pronouncements, but in unwavering action, in principled stands against injustice, in the quiet strength that sees you through your darkest hours? Both she and Caleb faced their fears, and in doing so, they not only overcame a villain, but also the constraints of their pasts and the expectations of others. What does it mean to be truly free? Is it merely an absence of chains, or is it the courage to choose your own path, to define your own happiness, even if it defies convention? Lilybeth was stolen, but in her rescue and its aftermath, she found a new kind of freedom, the freedom to listen to her own heart. If this tale of courage, resilience, and unexpected love resonated with you, if it stirred your spirit or reminded you of the hidden strengths within yourself and others, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe for more inspirational stories of the human heart, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Lilybeth and Caleb's journey touched you the most? We look forward to hearing from you as we continue to explore the extraordinary moments where ordinary people find extraordinary courage and love.